two very competitive steers here to start this class out. I chose to use the young lady's predominantly black steer as he's the more complete steer. You really appreciate that look that he gives you from the side. He's a nice, clean, flat-sided type of steer that's carrying enough depth of rib to show some volume. When you get up over the top of the steer, I really think that's where he shines. You put your hand on him, he's got a big eye in him when we study him in that aspect, and he has the width between the shoulder blades to really prove it. He's a steer I maybe would like to see him carry down just a little more in his quarter, and that's something that the young lady's red and white does very well. You really appreciate the muscle and product that he carries down in that quarter. Just a steer that gets a little heavy when we study him on a balance standpoint. He's a steer in that center section that has a lot of volume, but when you put your hands on him, leaves you wanting a little more in that loin area. I wish he had just a little thicker back for the size of volume that he has in his center section. And he's a steer that tends to bulldog a little bit up front when we study him out on the move. He's a steer I really like to clean him up through that front shoulder as he tends to get a little heavy when we put him into motion. Young man's calf that comes out in third here, a little different type and kind than the two ahead of him that start the class. He's a steer that gets a little taller in his overall design, but I think he's the more complete steer than the young man's calf that comes behind him. The young man's calf that comes out in third, you really appreciate that way that hip squares up and that squareness of shape and muscle. He's a steer when we put our hands on, has an adequate amount of finish that we really appreciate. The young man's calf that comes out in fourth, as we said, starts to get into some structural issues and some balance issues. A steer that we really would like to change up the way that he goes about laying his hooks and pins around. A steer that we'd like to flatten out across the top. Young lady's speckled calf that comes out next here, a really flashy, attractive calf from the side. That pattern really helps him to pop from a show aspect. However, when we get behind him and study that muscle and product, he's a steer that leaves you wanting a little more when we study him in width from stifle to stifle and carrying down through the quarter. And the young man's calf that completes the class here, a very nicely volume type calf. You really appreciate the way that he brings that really productive look down through his lower third. Just a steer that we'd like to drop down in his twist and widen him out at his base and foundation to get him any higher in the class today. Let's give all those individuals a big round of applause.
Okay, this red and white steer exhibited by Madison Love is the reserve champion rated game steer for the dairy at 3.66 pounds per day. Placings on that class: first place to Anna Broom, second place to Madison Love, third place to Colin Griffith, fourth place to Cole Morgan, fifth place to Megan Griffith, sixth place to Lawson Hellman. We need our first place Holstein dairy steers back in the ring for champion Holstein. First place Holstein steers back in the ring. Second place Holstein steers need to be ready outside the ring. We need Rick Burner with your Class 5 first place, Anna Broom with your Class 6 first place, and Anna Broom with Class 7 first place. Milking Shorthorn dairy steers outside the ring. Milking Shorthorn dairy steers, be ready outside the ring. Following the milking Shorthorns, we need all champion and reserve champion dairy steers to come up to the ring. All champion and reserve champion dairy steers come up to the ring. You will follow the milking Shorthorns.
Oh yeah. Did you stay all the way through? Okay. We're checking out your thing about a delay. We only have it set for a 60-second delay, but we're checking to see, like, coming in live at certain places and then others depends like what they're doing, whether they're getting the feed at the same time. Huh? Oh, you haven't looked at it. Well, we were off for an hour. Cable was loose. That's what happens with technology.
Yeah.
But you can see here, if you see it on the TV, look how clear it looks.
I thought it was clear on my phone.
Really good. Yeah, what we're doing now is at the end of each event, we're going to, I gotta watch still.
Let's give all these Holstein exhibitors today a big round of applause. As we evaluate these three steers here, as we talked about in class, young lady on the end, just giving up a lot of pounds to the two steers behind her. So as we evaluate these two steers back here, young lady in the middle, you really appreciate that look from the side that steer gives you. He's a big volume capacity type of steer. He's a steer that maybe we'd like to change up the way that he goes about his rear third and his structure and the way that he uses his angles about his hip. But he gives you a lot of flash and volume from the side there. Now as we get over the top of that steer, he's a steer that gets a little more peaked and a little more flat in his design. I'd like to see him bloom out and blossom out just a little bit more in terms of usable product. The young lady on the back end here with the predominantly black steer, he's a steer that, as we talked about in class, has a lot of balance. You really appreciate what that steer does from front to back, and he's got that nice clean side look to him. And when we get behind him, I think his main advantage over the steer in front of him is when we talk about him on a width basis from stifle to stifle, and the way that he carries all that way from the top to bottom to his foundation, that width all the way through. Young lady, you'll be our champion.
Jerry Steer goes to Ann Bruce. With her class 7 steer, we need second place, Madison Love. Champion Holstein Dairy Steer plaque is donated by Adam Love.
As we evaluate these steers for our reserve here, I think there's one steer that just comes into the ring and overpowers the other ones in front of him. He's a really big bodied steer that we talked about in class that maybe gives up a little bit when you put your hands on him. However, when you study him, he's just a powerful steer. Young lady with the red and white will be our reserve.
Reserve champion goes to Madison Love. Okay, we're ready for milking Shorthorn. We need all of our champion dairy steers and reserve champion dairy steers ready outside the ring. After this class, we'll be selecting the grand champion dairy steer.
we sort these milking shorthorn influence steers, two steers that once again are quite a bit of ways from their finish point, so they're even on that plane as far as that evaluation goes. But we give the nod to the young lady's more productive milking shorthorn steer when we study him through his midsection. You really appreciate that width of rib and the depth that he's bringing into that lower third. And he's a steer when we get behind him, does enough when we study him down into that twist and carrying muscle and product down into that lower quarter to get him over the young man's steer that comes out in second. A steer that gets a little shallower in his design, he gets a little finer made in terms of his bone and hip structure. He's a steer that we really would like to change up and get him a little more mass and product even at this stage of the game. Let's give both those individuals a big round of applause.
Placing this class, first place goes to Jesse Serby. Second place to Jesse Serby. Okay, we need those will also be your champion reserve. We need our champion dairy steers back in the ring. Champion dairy steers in the ring. Okay, our champion Ayrshire is exhibited by Jackson Pedro. Our champion Brown Swiss is exhibited by Morgan Spurlock. Our champion Holstein, Anna Broom. And our champion Shorthorn Dairy Steer by Jesse Serby. Milking Shorthorn champion plaque was sponsored by Stephen and Melissa Sexton. Dairy starter steer exhibitors, Brown Swiss, please be getting ready. I'm sorry, we're going to take a 15-minute break following the championship beef steer. 15-minute break following the champion beef steer. Then we'll start with the Brown Swiss starter steers.
Let's give all these dairy steer exhibitors a big round of applause for today. Now, first off, before we go out here and start talking about the steers, I'd like to encourage all these exhibitors. It's just a hop, skip, and a jump over to the state fair here in a few weeks. I really encourage them to go out there. It's a real fun time at the state fair, and you're not that far away. I really encourage anybody that has any questions, ask myself or ask the Indiana State Fair Dairy Beef Queen that's standing over here today. If you got any questions at all, like I say, it's a real fun time. It's really a great thing to be a part of. As we get out here and start talking about these market steers, I think there's one steer out here that simply rises himself above the rest. He's a steer that we talked about in class as being a complete composite steer. That you really appreciate the way that he balances out from front to back. Steer that when we get him on the move, you really appreciate the way that he glides around the ring and that nice smooth side profile that he gives you. And a steer that carries a lot of width up and over that top and in those high dollar cut areas when we get our hands on him. Young lady with the black Holstein influence steer will be our grand.
Hey, your grand champion dairy steer goes to Anna Broom. Madison Love, we need your reserve champion Holstein. Okay, our grand champion dairy steer plaque is donated by Jim and Lisa Broyles. Our grand champion dairy steer banner by Ryan and Adrian Miller. I'm sorry. The grand champion dairy steer banner is Price Arrowhead Farms. Mike and Jamie Price. Price Arrowhead Farms.
As we come out here for reserve, this steer that comes in, steer that fought hard in that Holstein division in that class, was just a narrow miss for second. A steer that's doing a lot of the right things. You really appreciate the moderate frame size of this steer with a lot of capacity. As we talked about in class, maybe gets a little heavy fronted, gets a little waisty in that center section. When we put our hands on him, we'd like to see a little bit larger eyes relative to his size in that midsection. But a steer is doing a lot of things right that you really appreciate. The moderate frame size, the muscling that he brings down into that twist in the quarter. The young lady's red and white Holstein steer will be our reserve.
Reserve grand champion goes to Madison Love with her reserve champion Holstein. Reserve grand champion reserve grand champion dairy steer is sponsored by memory of Bob and Rosie Dillon. The banner for the reserve grand champion dairy steer is sponsored by Price Arrowhead Farms, Mike and Jamie Price. Morgan Spurlock, we need your brown Swiss steer back in the ring for champion born and raised. We're now showing for the grand champion Hendrick County born and raised dairy steer.
As we come out here and evaluate our born, bred, and raised here, I'm not going to comment too much on the state of the dairy industry. I think anybody that's familiar with it knows kind of the state of where things are at here. So it's really good to recognize, you know, what the producers and what the breeders in this county are doing here and kind of give them a spotlight with these kids' projects and these steers. The young lady's Brown Swiss is going to take this division. He's a really smooth-sided, clean steer that I think is just, in terms of his market readiness, is well above. Young lady will be our champion.
Champion born and raised is Morgan Spurlock, and that makes her a reserve champion going to Jackson Pay Grade. We will take a break now. At 10:45, we'll start the Brown Swiss starter jab. Brown Swiss starter steers at 10:45. Be at the ring